Hello and welcome to a tutorial on layers in Photoshop. What we're going to do in this tutorial is look at layers, the layer palette, how we move them around, what they're used for. We're also going to look at the type tool, and we're going to look at layer styles, and we're going to look at the gradient tool and the gradient editor. So how you can make your own gradient and save it. So what you'll need for this tutorial is you will need to go on Moodle, and let me show you the page. So if you go to the Level 3 90 Credit Diploma in Art and Design, you will see this section, Graphic Design Illustration. Go into there, and these are your start files. Layer, mask image, not that one. Oh, there we go. Layers tutorial start files. Okay, so that's where you'll find the start files for this. And they look like this, so let's open them up. Desktop, layer basics. Okay, so we can shift click to open all three at once, and they will open tabbed here. Look, and we've got this file with a keyboard. We've got this, which is how yours should look in the end, and we've got this, which is a file that we're going to have to copy over onto our start file to make a new layer. Okay, so what I'm going to do is just close this one down. You can see kind of how it's going to look, but you're going to put your name there rather than Z999. So let's close that down. Right, the first thing we want to do is copy this onto our Start02 file. And if you've done the selection tools tutorial, you will know that any object, any image with a white background or a single color background is really easy to cut out. We just need to get the Magic Wand tool and click on the background, and we'll select the white there. Obviously we want the opposite to that, we want the clock. So what we can do is go up to select and inverse, and did you see that swap round? Now we have the clock selected. So we want to copy that onto the other file. Now you'll see I've gone straight to the move tool. We need the move tool in order to move that over, and you'll see when I put my cursor over the clock it comes up with a little pair of scissors. That's what we want. And we just click. And the easiest way to move this across is click. I've got my mouse button held down, move it up to this tab, wait for it to swap over onto the other image, and move my mouse back down here. So before I let go of the mouse button though, if I drop it in the corner, it'll drop in the corner or here, wherever you have your cursor it will drop. If you want it to be pasted, kind of copied straight into the center, you can hold down the shift key before you let down, and that will make it drop in the center of the image. Okay, that's just a little tip. So now we've copied this over, we can see that we've got a layers palette here, look, and if you can't see your layers palette, you will find all your palettes in the window menu. So it's there, look, it's got a tick because it's open, and you can resize these and move them around. So let's just see what we've got here. So we can see this keyboard and we can see this clock layer, and we want to rename it. So easiest way to do that is double click actually on the type that says layer 1 and we'll type clock, hit return. So we can see these two layers. We've got two other layers here that we can't actually see, gauge and bearing. If we want to see them, we can just click on this little space here, and that's your eye icon, that's view hide layer. Okay, so that's really useful. We can move layers around as well. Now if you notice, I've got the clock layer selected. You can click on layers to select them. I've got the clock layer selected. I've got my move tool. And if I click on the clock and move it around, there we go, we're moving the clock around. What happens if I click on the bearing? This is the bearing. Okay, it's not actually... Oh, it is. Ah, that's fantastic. Okay, so it won't when you do it because it's remembering my settings. When you open Photoshop and you've not had this setting on before, this is the setting, auto select, and it can be on group, but we want it on layer. So if auto select layer isn't on, then it will only move whichever layer you're on. So I'm on the bearing layer at the moment. If I wanted to move the clock layer, it doesn't matter if I click on it, look. It will only move the bearing layer. So, like it was originally for me, you want to make sure that auto select layer is ticked. Make sure you do actually change it from group to layer. It's much easier to use it that way. Okay, so what we're going to do now is let's position some of these items, and let's put the clock over here and the bearing over here. Okay, and let's say that we were quite happy with how these two items were in relation to each other, but we want to move them together. Okay, now this might not be visually a fantastic example, but say you have a series of items that make a border, and you want to move them all together. This is the way to do it. This is particularly useful. So firstly, what I want to do is I want to hold Shift down on my keyboard, and then I want to click on the bearing layer. So I've got both of them selected. Then you can either right click or control click if you were using a Mac, like this, and you'll get your menu up, and you can go to link layers. You can also go up here to layer and link layers. They both have the same result, and that is that you'll get a little chain symbol in each of these layers, and now when I move one layer, they both move together. So what we're going to do next is we're going to do a free transform, and we should have done this before, but if we go to Edit, Free Transform, you'll see the shortcut for that is Command and T. So hit Command and T if you want. And you'll see it's come up with a bounding box around both objects across both layers. So now when I actually rotate, they will rotate together. And when I move them and when I resize them, because I'm going to size them down a little bit, so just size them down a little bit like that. And pop them over here. Ooh, I'll rotate it a little bit more. Okay, pop them over there like that. And then remember, you have to either click the tick or hit return on the keyboard to say that you're happy. So we've linked those layers, we've moved them. To unlink them, what do? Dead easy, just right click, unlink layers. Okay, or the option is in the layers menu as well. So next what we want to do is let's have a little look at layered transparency. So I mean, layers are great. Just a little bit about layers. It's like having your artwork on sheets of acetate, and you can edit them individually, you can change the colours, and you won't affect the other layers. You can also drag them up and down. So we can drag a layer and we can pop it in between other layers, and you see a little line appears wherever I'm going to drop it. So I'm clicking and dragging, and I'll just put it back where it was for now. Okay, so we can move them up and down. So what we'll look at next is opacity. We can change the opacity of a layer. Opacity, you just think of it as transparency. Opaque means something that is not see-through. So if its opacity is 100%, then it's solid, you can't see through it. If you take that down, it becomes transparent. Okay, so have a little play around with that. Okay, we'll leave that on 80%. So take your opacity down to 80%. Now, as well as opacity, which lets you kind of see other layers through things, you can change the blend mode. The blend mode lives here. Now, it doesn't have a label on it, but many things in Photoshop, you know, the tools and the commands and drop-down menus, they will tell you what they are if you just stop moving your cursor, you just leave your cursor over them. So set the blending mode for this layer. So it's on normal by automatic by default. Have a click through some of these and see what kinds of effects you get. So you can see that we've got overlay, pin light, difference. Okay, you'll notice they're divided into different sections. Okay, you do kind of get used to what they do. And at a very basic level, normal and dissolve are kind of on their own. Darken. These commands often darken it in some way. The ones from lighten onwards will lighten it in some way. These tend to make some areas darker and some lighter. Difference, exclusion, subtract, divide, kind of all much of a muchness. I'm not sure if they're photography based. And hue, saturation, colour are colour based. Okay, depending on what image you're using and what the background is, they have very different results. So let's have a look. I'm going to leave mine on screen, and there we go. I'm quite happy with that. Or am I? It looks a bit light, isn't it? Let's go for multiply. Yeah, we'll leave it on multiply. Just to show you as well what's actually happening. If I zoom in there, you can see that these effects are live. It's just not just doing it to one layer. Best example might be darken. If I put a darken effect on here, and I'm just going to take the opacity back up to 100 just to show you this, I can only see things on the clock layer that are darker than the layer below. Okay, so if I start to move this around, you will see that different things become visible. So when I, for example, move the hour hand over something behind it that is lighter, you will start to see that darker part of the hour hand on there. So these effects are kind of live, if you see what I mean. Okay, let's put my opacity back on 80%, and I'm going to put it back on multiply. Okay, so let's just fit on screen again, which is Command and 0. And the next thing we're going to do is look at hold on, I forgot what we're doing next. Oh yeah, we're going to put a gradient layer on there. So to make a new layer, we can either go to the layer menu. Obviously all the layer commands are in the layer menu, but your layers palette is very useful as well, and we have a little symbol here called create new layer. If you click on that, new layer will appear. We're going to make a gradient on this layer, so I'm going to double click where it says layer 1 and I'm going to type gradient. Hit return. Now we are going to use the gradient tool, it lives over here, and let's have a look. So this is a gradient that I made earlier, so I'm just going to put it on a standard gradient. You may well be on black and white if this is one of the first times you've used Photoshop. So you have these swatches to select from. They're just in this little drop down menu here, and you know, these are great, but we often want to create our own. In fact, before we do create our own, let's just pick one randomly. I'll go with red and green. And the way that we actually use this gradient tool is we click wherever you want, drag, and let go. Now, I've got this on linear. This is a linear gradient. I can choose from these options here. I can have radial. That means that it actually goes from the center outwards, circular. We've got angle gradient, which looks like this. And we've got diamond, which looks like this. Okay. For this tutorial, I'll be using linear, but you can use what you want. So I've got the linear gradient on. I'm going to drag like this, and there we go. We've got that gradient. Well, what if we want to make our own gradient? Well, I'm actually just going to delete what I've done here on this gradient. So I'm going to go to Select All, and I'm actually just going to hit the backspace key on my keyboard, and that'll get rid of what I've done. Okay, now we want to make our own gradient. So I'm going to go over to the gradient editor, and this is something that you'll have to remember because it's not entirely obvious. But the way to edit this gradient is actually to click, and it does tell you, it says click to edit the gradient. So I click on that and the gradient editor comes up. Okay, so this gives us the control we need to make our own gradient. We've got these stops, okay? The little tabs are called stops. And if I click on a stop, I'll get the colour appear here. If I click on the colour again, kind of getting used to clicking on the colour because it's much more useful than clicking on these, which will give you foreground, background or user, but much more easy to click on this. Then you can pick whatever colour you want. You can click in the spectrum and then click on here to select which actual colour you want. And what will I go with? I'll go with yellow. And I will say OK. And there we go, it's changed to yellow. We've got a midpoint here as well. You can move this, you can grab this and move it. That's at the point at which the yellow becomes more green. It's the kind of 50% blend point. What other things you can do? You can add more colours. So the way to add another stop is to move your cursor below the bar and click, and you'll get another colour stop come up. And again, I can change the colour by clicking in here, and I will go with, no, I'll go with a blue. So with a blue, and say OK. There you go. You can do that as many times as you want, and you can create quite complex gradients. At the top, we have these stops, and these are opacity stops. If I click on these, you'll see I've got opacity here, and we know that that's to do with transparency. And I can click, and I get a slider, and what I'd like you to do is take your opacity on the right hand side down to 30%. Okay, So this is going to be my gradient. You can choose whatever colours you want. I'll put one more colour in actually. I'll put one more colour in here that's a little bit brighter. We'll go with a pink. Lovely. So, what if I want to use this gradient again? It can be really useful to actually pop this into this little swatches presets. I should call it presets area. And I'm going to give it a name. So I will call this gradient Richard's new gradient. There we go. And if I click new, you'll see it pops into the presets, and that means that we can easily use it again. So I'm going to say OK, and you'll see it's automatically selected up here. It doesn't matter if I deselect. I've obviously got my selection running, but if you do want to deselect, it's Command and D. And now I'm going to click on the left. Let me just put my layers palette back where it should be in there. So I'm going to click and drag from one side to the other, and you will see that it's 100% opaque over here, and then it becomes transparent to 30% transparency as we go over to the other side. So that's what we want. That's great. Now, we do, however, only want this over our layers palette. Sorry, over our keyboard layer. Over our keyboard layer. So let me just pull that down a bit. Might have to. Yeah, there we go. And we need to just grab this, drag it below the clock layer. Oh, it's not letting me. Hold on. There we go, below the clock layer. And that's how we move it. If you did want to drag something behind the background layer, you can. The background layer automatically has a padlock. If you want to make it a normal layer, a padlock means that you can't move it, you can't do anything with it. If I double click on it, I can turn it into a normal layer, and it will ask me if I want to name it. Just name it keyboard. Okay, that becomes a normal layer. If I did want to move this layer behind the base layer, I could. There we go, but I don't. So I'm going to leave it where it was. Okay, so that's how we release that background layer. The next thing we're going to do then is we're going to have a little look at type. So grab the type tool and just click. It might take a little bit of thinking. And when it wakes up, just click in this area here. Come on, you can do it. There we go. Okay, so there we go. Click, and I'm just going to type my name. Excuse me. So, if you have got a smaller typeface there, you can change your typeface up here. You can change your font up here. So have a little look around. You've got justification, left, centered, right. You've got the text color there, and we're going to look at this other command in a second. And this brings up your character palette. It's just a quick way to get to it rather than have to go to Window and where are you, character there. Okay, so pick a font, make it nice and chunky and big. 48 point is great. Pick a typeface, like I say. When you want to edit type, by the way, if you're using the type tool, when you're not close to the word, it becomes the move tool and you can move the typeface around, which is useful. I might actually make it a bit bigger. Let's highlight that. Let's make it 60 point. There we go. Okay, if you actually move to the move tool, it deselects, and if you want to reselect your type again, you have got two options. You can get the type tool and you can click on your word and you'll get a flashing cursor, and you can double click on the T in the type tool. So if I double click there, that will automatically highlight the word. Something to tell you about type layers actually is that they are vector layers, not bitmap or raster. Bitmap or raster means made up by pixels. And let me just illustrate that. If I resize my type, you will see that no matter how big that type gets, it doesn't pixelate. Yeah? I'm just going to escape, undo that. Okay. If I did that with, for example, the gauge layer, you'll see that it gets terribly pixelated. Can you see it's breaking up? Okay, that's because all the layers apart from the type layer here are bitmap, are made of pixels. The type layer is vector. That means that Photoshop just remembers the shapes and it makes those bigger or smaller. It's almost like curves and lines. It remembers it through mathematics. Okay, the thing we need to remember about that is we can't do any normal editing with things like the brush tool on a type layer. As soon as we get the brush tool and try to edit it, it will come up with a prohibited sign. If you do want to actually edit type or work on top of type on a type layer, we would need to go to type and rasterize type layer. When we do that, the T disappears, and that becomes just a picture of the word. I can no longer get the type tool and click in there. It will just create a new type layer. It won't edit what's there. So you are losing the editability, but you can now edit it. So you need to remember that. I'm going to undo because I want mine to remain editable. So the next thing we're going to do is I'm just going to change the color of my type. I'm going to double click on it, on the type, on the T, on the type layer, and I'm going to click in here to change my type color. I will go with darkish red. That's good. Okay. Now let's have a look at this little tool here. This will allow you to use the warp commands on your type. So just click on Style Arc to start with. Have a play around with that. You should see it start to bend when it's finished thinking. Hopefully your machine's a bit faster than mine. You've got arc, you've got flag, you've got all sorts of different things. You can change the bend on them, so you can have positive, negative. You can take it to horizontal distortion, vertical distortion. Have a little play around with it. So you do quite a lot of stuff on there. Say OK when you're happy. And there we go. That's how we would use the warp type tool. Just a little note. You wouldn't use Photoshop if you are doing a lot of types. If you're doing a leaflet or a multi-page document, Photoshop is not really designed to work with bodies of type. You want to be using Illustrator for kind of posters and leaflets and any kind of substantial multi-page document you want to use InDesign. That's if you're using Adobe products anyway. So I've put my warp on my type. I'm going to click on my move tool now as soon as my Mac stops thinking, and we will have a little look at, come on, you can do it. It's having a little trouble because it's having to record me on QuickTime as well. There we go. So click on the move tool. This should become unhighlighted shortly. There we go. And the next thing we're going to do is add a layer style. The layer styles live here, and if we go to layer style, you'll see these options. They also live here in this little effects icon. So I can click on the effects and you'll see the same options here. Just start off by adding a bevel and emboss. Okay, I'm just going to show you bevel and emboss, and you explore the other options as much as you wish. We have different kinds of bevels that we can pick. Outer bevel, inner bevel. You'll see that as the bevel on the outside. Put it back in a bevel. You can change the depth, so that makes it look like it's kind of coming out from the surface more. You can change the direction up or down. That's from basically where the light source is coming from. You change the size, so you can see there's more light, less light. Take it down a little bit. And you can soften it. So if you take soften down to 0, it's quite a sharp transition. Take it up, it gets a bit softer. This is the angle where the light's coming from. You can move this around. If you look, I've got the light coming from the top left there. Obviously, if I move that over here, it's coming from the top right. You've got gloss contour controls basically the transition from the shadow to the light. By default, it's a smooth transition, but it doesn't have to be. You can play around with these, and that will make it go, in that case, quite light in the middle. I'm going to leave it on that though. You've got highlight mode, which is screen by default, but you can play around with that. That's like your blend mode. You have the options of all the different blend modes for how the highlights work and for how the shadows work. So there's one for you. You don't have to say OK and go in and out. You can add others. I'm not going to click on these because I'm just a bit worried about it pausing on me and seeing the beach ball of death. So at that, I'm going to leave my type at that and say OK. And there we go. So we have covered there a number of things. Basics about layers, about moving them, about auto select, about type layers, gradients, opacity. If you use Photoshop, you need to get used to using layers. They're a really useful feature. The last thing that I will say is when you save a Photoshop document, you will need to go to File and Save As, and it will probably automatically be in the Photoshop format, okay, which will end in .psd. Okay, you need to save it in the Photoshop format so that it saves all your layers. You can flatten these. I can go to Layer and Flatten Image, okay, which makes it a smaller file, and if you want to send it to a printer, that will be a smaller file. But if I now saved that, I would obviously not be able to edit my layers, okay. And some formats, if you want to save as JPEG, PDF, sometimes it will come up with, depending on versions and things, it will say you want to save your layers, or other times, depending on what format you're using, it will just flatten the layers, so be really careful of that. Okay, so thanks for watching and listening. Hope you managed to produce that tutorial piece, and normally it's because people need to catch up, so if you bring that in, we can pass you on this tutorial. So thanks for listening again, and I will see you later.